All right. I am joined by a good friend of mine and coach and neuroscientist, Daniel Lathen. Thought we could have a conversation today about, well, lots of things. I've had some, um, I've been doing some thinking, especially since my first son is going to be born in just over a month from the time of this recording. Been thinking about the role of a parent. And also I'm always fascinated by, you know, what is the proper way to understand the world and ourselves and our position in it. So anyway, I thought we could chat about that today, if that sounds okay with you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Congrats on the upcoming child, by the way. They're a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And I'm
so
happy to be here.
well, yeah, I'm glad you're here. I thought I would just start out by kind of maybe word vomiting my current line of thinking, and then I figure you'd have a lot of commentary on it. Feel free to stop me at any point if you want to interject. But anyway, as I've been thinking about, especially the role of a parent, something that I've been thinking about, what is it that what can I do for my child? What should I do for my child? What are my responsibilities? What are things I should not do? All those things. And I kind of came to a few conclusions. And I think there's one I really want to hone in on today. At least one of them is to be a model of what it looks like to properly interact with the world. So that'd be one thing. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people usually think of when they think of parenting. But some of the other things I've thought of is I think it's important to try to prevent my child from experiencing trauma, because I think that trauma is not the same as a hard learning experience. I think that trauma, at least in my understanding, is something that actually stunts growth, prevents you from learning, and hinders you in your personal search for meaning. So I consider trauma to be very different from like a challenge. I think challenges are important. And then the other thing is I've been thinking in terms of like to inoculate them against addiction. I don't know of a better way to think about that, but essentially give them the tools and, not allow them to get exposed to things at a time when they're not ready to be exposed to them. Because I think that as a parent, one of my goals is to help my child to be as autonomous as possible. And I think that addiction is something that essentially prevents autonomy. I think it strips away your ability to make conscious decisions about certain things. And so that's, I think, a good area we could focus on is addiction. And so one of the things I wanted to ask about, so I'll give a little bit more of a premise here in terms of my thinking. I've been thinking about what an addiction is, and I'm not a neuroscientist. And I don't really come at this necessarily from like a brain science perspective. I come at it from like more of a philosophical perspective. And so the way that I've thought of an addiction is it's something that that gives you the sense or the feeling that a need or a desire is being fulfilled without actually fulfilling the underlying criteria for that need or desire. It just gives you the false sense that it's being fulfilled. And it also, by doing so, there's the opportunity cost, and it actually prevents you from, what would you say, deprives you of the ability to fulfill whatever that need or want is in the future. That's how I've thought of an addiction. Does that definition kind of make sense with, the neuroscientific version of addiction, or is that off base?
Yeah, I mean, I love your definition in terms of it sounds great, and I feel like that can be useful. It's definitely not exactly how, neuroscientists define it.
Figured.
But as we mentioned before, neuroscientists strictly define it based off of the DSM-5 manual that tells like psychiatrists how to define all the different brain disorders we can have, and they just have a list of criteria. If you meet enough of the criteria, then you're suddenly across the line and you're addicted.
Mm-hmm.
Which is fine for psychiatric work, but not very helpful for most of us, because most of us fit most of those criteria, and a lot of those criteria for common things that are like not harmful at all. I mean, technically, we're all addicted to food because,
Yeah.
right?
Most of us, yeah.
I mean, anyone that gets hungry and feels this need to eat regularly, they're addicted to food. And a lot of us are addicted to hobbies, like even if they're really good.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of think of it in a strict sense as either no one is really addicted to anything except for maybe the like actual people who are addicted to drugs, who have a physiological addiction where their body demands it.
Mhm.
There's that whole class of addiction, and then there's a psychological addiction, which is also defined and accepted in the neuroscience community. But as I've said, it's kind of like everyone has a psychological addiction or no one does.
Yeah, right.
Because we all have things that we turn to because we enjoy it and or because we're trying to escape. And of course, it's the escaping that I think is where it really becomes an issue of, are we doing this thing, kind of like you mentioned, are we doing this thing to an extent that is hurting us because we're just trying to escape our feelings, escape our lives by
Mhm.
Either doing drugs, eating, like using social media excessively, watching Netflix, even exercise. All these things can become escapes. I think that's when it gets harmful. But as far as defining what is specifically as an addiction, I guess to me, it's helpful to consider addiction versus habit, because an addiction will have that dopamine release in your brain, of course, that kind of is one of the hallmarks of addictions, whereas just a habit might not. And an addiction will also, you'll be willing to sacrifice, even if you're going to hurt yourself in order to pursue this thing, you'll do it anyway, because your brain has kind of lost that ability to choose. Like you said, there's a lack of autonomy, a lack of freedom at that point, where even though it's harmful, you do it anyway. Whereas with a habit, you still have a lot more choice. And if you really consider the pros and cons, you can easily decide, no, I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, we might be digging into the realm of more like psychology and philosophy with this question, but you mentioned like with an addiction, you might like lose the ability to choose, or at least it's becomes harder to choose, which kind of suggests that there's a part of you, which is you, or what we usually think of as you, that chooses things. And then there's a part of you that's not what you usually think of as you, that
Right.
that can actually act and take over your body. So how would you differentiate those from a more technical perspective?
Great question. So, I mean, there's a lot of answers to this. Like you said, it could get philosophical. I mean, I could talk about how, the real you is like your spirit, and then the part that you're trying to control is your body or something like that. But more in terms of the brain, it's really the difference between your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that does rational decision making, versus kind of all the parts that are not your prefrontal cortex.
Everything else.
Right. Everything else is just kind of following set patterns. It's your subconscious, because it is affecting how you think. It's affecting what you do. It's affecting everything about you. It's affecting how you feel without you really being conscious of it. We're pretty much just conscious of those thoughts that are going through our prefrontal cortex for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really the battle between your conscious self, which knows what is really best for you and what you really want, versus all your subconscious parts of your brain that are just kind of more survival based. They might just be telling you, go do this thing because we think that this will help us survive, which may not even be accurate.
So how do the non-prefrontal cortex parts of the brain hijack the decision-making process?
That's a good question. So you can kind of think about it in terms of a program where your subconscious thoughts are really just a program that your brain is running. And that program starts with an input, which is your senses. So you sense cues in your environment, either visually, smell, taste, sound, even other senses. Well, we have more than 5, by the way. 5 is the 5 senses thing is a myth.
How many do we have?
Well, that's a tough answer, but
a little harder.
A lot more.
more than 5. Okay.
Right. But regardless, we use all these senses combined with our memory so that something in our environment cues us, right? And that could be, in the case of drug addicts, that's easy. It's maybe the sight of a needle or something like that, or the smell of beer. We can have a lot more complicated cues. You can have something like my parents, or maybe say my mom used to get this kind of look on her face where you could tell that she's pissed, but she doesn't want to actually say anything. And then bad things start to happen.
Right.
Something that subtle can be the cue that you kind of feel more than you can't really necessarily identify it, but you can feel it. So these cues can be subtle, and they activate programs in our brain because they're linked to our memories, and they tell us in this situation, this is what we should expect in terms of punishment or reward, good or bad things happening. And once that program starts, the program basically tells you this is how you should respond. And by program, of course, this is a neural circuit, a neural system of neurons talking to other neurons that talk to other neurons, until the output is how you should respond. And so you might have learned growing up, for instance, that when your mom has that face, you should respond by just shutting up and getting really quiet and stiff. That's a freeze response, by the way. And so maybe that's the output, is you do a freeze response because you've figured out that was the best way to handle that situation. And so, of course, if that output though is a harmful behavior, then we really need to dig into how do we, where did that come from? Because the behavior is the output. So what happened before that? What were you feeling? What were you thinking consciously? And what were you thinking unconsciously that was just buried in that subconscious part of your brain that led to that undesirable behavior? Does that kind of answer the question?
Well, yeah. So I'd like to dig into that in terms of what's actually going on. So you mentioned, I like the analogy of like programs. So to kind of flesh out, I'm going to use a whiteboard, and I don't know if I'm actually going to use it effectively or not, but for some reason I want to. So we can treat, so like I'm an engineer by background, so I've worked with lots of programs and machines and things like that. And so there's this term black box, which a lot of people use the term black box. Essentially, you've got an input and an output, and the stuff in the middle that changes the input to an output is maybe kind of a question mark. We don't necessarily know what's in there, or maybe we don't need to know. So we could say that, our subconscious is somewhat of a black box in terms of it's so complicated in there. We can describe some of what's going on, but mostly what we can observe is the inputs and the outputs. Is that fair? I mean, you could probably describe the inside of this black box a lot better than most people, but for most of us, it's a black box.
No, I think that's really accurate, because it's the easiest thing is noticing your behavior. Like, what is the output? And that's what we're usually, mad at ourselves for. And then with a little thought, you can maybe identify how it all started. What was that input? What cues me to get into this mode where I'm, maybe if I just have an upcoming deadline, I'm anxious, that's my input. That cues me getting into the mode. And the black box is honestly, in a lot of ways, still a black box to neuroscientists and psychologists, but there are a lot of things that we do know, which can help us start to dig into there and really figure out like what is happening, both in terms of the neurons themselves, and more importantly for most people, in terms of like what is happening in kind of my psyche that is leading me to react this way.
Yeah.
When you can identify that, you can start to kind of to counteract that.
Yeah. So I was thinking, going back to the explanation of addiction that I was putting forward, I would think of this like there's a program in here, and essentially it's expecting some like a category of inputs. So if I'm thinking in terms of like a computer program, like you can write a program that is expecting to get an input of like a single digit or something like that. It has a certain set of inputs that it's expecting, and so it's going to accept it in that way, and then it's going to do something with that number that's put in, and then it's going to spit something out based on it. So a lot of times when I'm thinking about like how people's behaviors have changed, especially over like long timelines. So like multi-generational timelines. I'm thinking, okay, well, you've got at first you can kind of think of AI, how you train them, they can drive a certain course over and over and over again. They keep hitting walls, and every time they hit a wall, they get like one more piece of information. But they start out like blank slate. They don't really know anything, and then they build the algorithm based on all this experience. And so I kind of think of that as potentially a way to think about the development of like human consciousness, of being let me think about over time learn to better and better approximate um, reality. It's learned to better and better identify the types of behaviors that are going to get certain outcomes. And so what happens is you get some sort of stimuli, and it accepts it, runs into that program, and it says, okay, essentially, if we run it through this program and the result is a 1, then we are going to pass it on, and it's going to essentially say we'll get a feeling of pleasure, and that's going to cause us to go do that thing again. So if it outputs a 1, feeling of pleasure, essentially trying to reinforce a behavior. If it's an output of 0, then maybe a feeling of displeasure, apathy, and you're not going to do that thing again. And so when I think about addiction, I think of there's like a couple of different things that I perceive as potentially being what's happening, which could be either it's giving an unexpected input into our system that's kind of like, I don't know, are you familiar with the idea of like SQL injection or anything like that?
In programming?
Yeah, it's like
Not that specific term, no.
okay, so that's just one thing like a hacker can do. They can essentially put in a line of code, so that you might think of like you log into a website. Instead of putting their username, they actually put a line of code into that, and then it sends it into the database where it's going to say, okay, I'm going to look for this username in my database, but instead it runs that line of code that they put in and essentially it hijacks the the code that's already there by inserting its own code into it. So I could see like that would be one thing I would consider to be like, for example, like cocaine or addictive drugs. It's kind of like an input that breaks the system, so to speak, where it's feeding in an input that's going to automatically run like a different sequence rather than the one that we're supposed to be running. Or you could also think of it as instead it's bypassing this program altogether, and it's just straight up feeding whatever that pleasurable output number would be to the next system. So it's just saying, I'm just going to bypass this altogether. I'm just going to throw that 1 value into the next thing so you feel pleasure. And then you keep doing it. Sorry, does that make sense? That kind of conception of it?
Yeah, that does. Let me think. I wouldn't say it bypasses though, because
Okay.
the tricky thing about addiction is it uses our natural, built-in systems, and that's why we can't just like kill some cells or turn off a gene or.
Well, here, let me clarify really quickly. So, for example, and my terminology is going to be weak here, but like you could have something that if you were to ingest it, it would cause a dopamine release somewhere. That would be like an example of this hijacking. If it, otherwise you probably shouldn't do that. So that'd be one way. So it's going through the normal channels, but it's causing something to happen that, probably isn't in our best interest, maybe. Or the direct input, I would consider that to be like, well, you actually just go into the person's brain, you just like inject dopamine into that spot. So that would be an example of you're bypassing the brain's natural production of a certain neurotransmitter, and you're just straight up like putting it in there. Does that make sense as being like the programming analogy?
Somewhat. Let me say something and then see if this jives with what you were saying.
Great.
Which is that with addiction, it's the issue is usually that it's an overload. So it's not necessarily kind of different pathways or anything. It's often just an overload of the same pathways.
Okay.
Where like cocaine, for instance, I believe releases, and like I think it's like 100 times more dopamine than sex does. And because of that overload, then your system starts to respond in ways that it's really shouldn't, and it's doing it to try to protect itself. But for instance, one of the ways it protects itself is by then tuning down your future dopamine levels. That's why you get anhedonia, or the inability to feel pleasure. Because if you're addicted to something, your brain is trying to compensate by actually tuning down how much pleasure you can feel so that it won't be so overloaded when you do the drug. And it's the overload and honestly the kind of unnatural access that we have to things now. For instance, we can, all theoretically get addicted to food, but back in the day that wasn't a problem because most people didn't have enough food to get addicted to. Right. And they certainly couldn't get addicted to cell phone notifications. They couldn't get addicted to pornography. They couldn't get addicted to a lot of drugs, though alcohol and a few others have been around for a while. But even before they existed, maybe people weren't addicted to anything because nothing kind of activated their brain in such an intense and unnatural way.
Right.
But now that we have all those things so accessible, it's really easy to give in to what your brain tells you. Your brain just thinks, oh, this helps us survive, either for sugar, because it's sugar, or because it's reproduction, or because it's, in the case of distraction, it's our brain is trained to pay attention to novel things so that we can be observant and avoid danger. All these things are meant to help us survive. And so when you get addicted, your brain is really just being fooled into thinking that these things will help you survive, and so just do more and more and more of it. When in fact,
right. Yeah. So essentially, the feeling of pleasure is something that our brain generates in response to behaviors or things that seem like things that have helped people survive throughout human history.
Eons, yeah.
Right. And so we have a lot of things, I think, in our modern world that approximate. They essentially, they're close enough that our brain can't tell them apart from things that historically were good, and that we should, they should just trigger pleasure, because it's like you should do more of that whenever you have the option to. But then when you have unlimited access, it becomes a serious issue. So I guess to go back to the parenting thing, it's like I feel like one of the things I need to do as a parent is to help my child to be aware of the dangers of that, be aware that that's part of how their brain works. And so they need to be aware, hey, just because something makes you feel good doesn't mean it's something you should, do as much as possible. And here's why, and here's the dangers of that. So I know you're not a self-proclaimed parenting expert or anything, but just from the perspective of how do I take care of my kid, what are some things that I could be paying attention to as warning signs of something that you'd actually classify, using your own language or what you think is useful, as like, this is an addiction versus, okay, this is a good learning experience? Because I think that can be really hard, like line a lot of times for parents.
Right. Of like where to cut them off in terms of exploring versus, okay, you've got too far.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. And I do have 2 kids, but the oldest is 4. So of course she's hopefully not addicted or even close to being addicted to anything yet. But I think, kind of off the top of my head, what I'd want to watch for is, I guess just kind of some of the hallmarks that set something apart as an addiction versus just like a habit or something you like to do. And so that might be things like tolerance. Is it getting more and more extreme? So that's one.
How would you go about paying attention for that or looking for that?
I mean, it depends what you're talking about, I guess, but it might honestly just require that you have a very open and honest relationship with your kid. And I think that's helpful in a lot of areas, not just in terms of addiction, to make sure that, you could ask them a question about maybe their phone use or whatever else it is. And expect that they'll usually give you a pretty honest answer because they trust you and feel
So would
safe.
that look something like, so let's say, for example, your kid has access to some sort of game or whatever, and the first time they play it, they're really excited to play for 5 minutes, and then you're able to pull them away from it, and it's maybe they're not super happy about that, but they can kind of snap their attention back to something else other than the game. And then later it becomes, well, it takes about 10 minutes before they can actually readjust their tension, and it keeps getting longer. Is that, I mean, is that a realistic way to do that, or is that, I don't know, do you think it would actually work that way?
I think so, because that's the other factor is what happens when you take it away, essentially. And which I was going to get to is, a big hallmark of addiction is withdrawal. And if you can take it away and be okay, just feel okay, then you're probably fine. But if it's taken away from you and suddenly you just like are super stressed, super unhappy, maybe don't know what to do with yourself, don't know what to do with your time, you just kind of fall apart, then that's a sign that it's probably reached an unhealthy level because you're psychologically dependent on it at that point.
Right.
So maybe, I mean, intermittent fasting has kind of been becoming more popular lately, and maybe there's something to be said for kind of for yourself and for your kids, like fasting from things sometimes, which is actually a part of a lot of religions, possibly not coincidentally. Because when you can fast from something, you can first of all notice how you respond, and then you can also have that break of kind of snapping out of it if you need to. And
yeah, I like that. I don't think I really heard anybody say that before in terms of like the idea of fasting as, because often, yeah, it's either referred to as like a diet practice or like an actual religious ritual or something like that, but it's also just, it's not just giving the thing up, but it's actually, it gives you feedback on yourself. It's like, okay, well, if I give something up and then it messes with me or I have a lot of negative emotions or I feel anxiety or whatever, that's a pretty good sign that my relationship with that thing is as unhealthy. I think that's, I mean, that might feel kind of obvious, but I know from working with people and from just thinking about myself and and everything, a lot of things that are intuitive and make a lot of sense, it doesn't mean that we actually ever do them.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that people often want to cite like science as their ultimate authority, and then when you actually look at their lives and the way that they conduct themselves, they are extremely unscientific in the way that they approach life. Because one thing I've learned, because I've always thought, at least before, it's like, oh, science, so it's just you go based on things where there's a lot of good evidence for them, whatever. But it's like, no, like the scientific approach is really, you have to make predictions. You have to have hypotheses. I think that's a part that people miss, is you actually need to make predictions, and then you need to see what actually happens, and then you need to make a comparison.
Right.
And I think it's the prediction part that a lot of people miss, because it's like they say they, science is their religion or something like that, or they try to act in a scientific way, and you're like, okay, what are the predictions that you're making right now? What are the ways in which your hypotheses recently have been, not true, and what's the feedback you got from that? Like, well, I don't want to make predictions. What do you mean predictions? It's like, and I think that's a really good example of something, that you can do, is predict how you'll feel if you stop something or you take something away.
And most people don't even take the time to consider that. It's just kind of, they just stick with their habit and don't consider, like, how is this actually affecting me in my life, and am I okay with that? And I actually did a challenge for myself a few months ago. I called it my snap back to reality challenge. Because for 1 week I didn't let myself do anything that was based in some sort of fantasy world. So no video games, no movie, no TVs that wasn't, unless they were about like the real world. No like fantasy books, no just games. None of that. And I discovered, like I said, I didn't realize before how dependent I kind of was on these things. Because as soon as I took that away, I was like, holy crap, I'm a little bored. I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
And I have so much time on my hands. But the amazing thing was the first day I did that was like one of the most productive days of my life.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
got a lot of things done off my checklist. I connected with my family. I cleaned up. I played guitar, which I kind of want to do, but I almost never actually make time for.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I just did all these things that were grounded in real life and improved my real life instead of just escaping into some sort of fantasy world.
Yeah. So you brought up boredom. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I've kind of held the belief for a while now that boredom is extremely valuable. I think it has a lot of utility. That boredom is essentially your brain trying to tell you, hey, whatever you're doing right now, it's not the best thing you could be doing. You should probably, it's pain that your brain inflicts upon you in order to get you to take action or do something or seek out novelty. One way to think about it. And I think that, oftentimes the best thing you can do is put yourself in a situation where you feel bored for a while, because then your brain is going to start to search and start to ask questions and search for things worth doing. And the longer you sit there, the more you'll come up with, and the more you'll get some direction. And I think that's another way that addictions can be dangerous, because if you're not addicted, well, depending on your definition of addiction, we talked about that, but if you're not really addicted to anything in an unhealthy way, then that boredom is going to prompt you to do something really meaningful and useful, or at least interesting.
Right.
If you are addicted to something, that boredom is going to prompt you to go back to that same thing every single time,
Right. Right.
above other things. And so I think that could be another thing of, if you, first of all, are terrified of being bored, that's something interesting to think about. But also, if every time you're bored, the same answer comes up as what you should do, that might be a bad sign.
Right.
Is that a useful self-test, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I've never even really thought about boredom in this way, so you're teaching me. But yeah, I think that sounds really incredible, because it's like if you find yourself just with nothing to do that you have to do, and you revert to the same thing over and over, that's probably what you're addicted to. But if you, on the opposite side of things, if you can use that space, I think our brains are actually really good at telling us what's most important.
Mhm.
So often you might start thinking about maybe I don't know, maybe your relationship with your significant other, or something that's been really more core to your life and is,
Mhm.
kind of a foundational thing that is affecting a lot of things in your life. But because you usually just jump straight to your phone, you don't ever notice, you don't ever let yourself really think about it and process it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think when you're bored, what your brain is trying to do by kind of causing that discomfort is draw your attention to whatever needs your attention.
Right.
um,
Right.
and so that, those systems have evolved essentially to draw your attention to that thing that is actually best to do. But the more that those systems have been hijacked, the less reliable that cue is going to be. But it can also be feedback that, hey, I've messed up this orienting system. Because if it's always orienting in the same direction, and I go do that thing and then I come back to being bored and it just tells me to go right back to it every time, that's probably not a good sign.
Right.
Or it could be indicating like you still haven't fully addressed that issue. But if it's not really an issue to address, oh, I'm really blurry. I'll
Yeah.
fix that. If it's not like an important issue to address, then it's more likely that it's an addiction.
Right. You're blurry
But,
again.
oh my goodness, what's going on? Might be my lighting in here is, I'm trying to work on it. It's a little bit too, I think, still too dark.
Better than
Maybe.
mine, but
Yeah. So one thing I've thought about with like raising children is the importance of letting them be bored. And that could also be a good way to, as a parent, as feedback, like, hey, if I let my kid be bored and I don't like shove entertainment onto them, what do they do? And you can kind of observe them.
Right.
And if they start to just explore different things, it's like, okay, good. They're not they're not just like every single time they're just sitting in front of the TV, like, please turn on, please turn on,
Right.
then okay, probably should keep the TV off then, because their
Right.
exploratory behavior
Give
is
them a
all being
TV fast.
hijacked in one direction.
Mhm.
And it really shouldn't be.
Right. And that's so key for creativity too. I'm really honestly worried about like when our generations and those younger than us are kind of the ones that are supposed to be creating the good things in the world,
Mm-hmm.
how good we're going to be at it. Because if you don't have that space to be bored and just let your mind wander, then you're not giving yourself a chance to learn creativity. And they've even done studies that toys that are just kind of simple objects, this is not actually a toy, but let's just say the lid to my water bottle, like this
Yeah.
would be a better toy than like for my toddler than something that is beeps and you have to hit the buttons the right way and then it does this thing in a predictable and kind of immutable way.
Right. Like it
Because
has a function.
right, it has a function. You learn how to do the function. That is all you're doing. You're learning how the
Right.
toy works. You're not learning how to play, and you're not learning how to be creative. And of course, as memory coaches, we also know that that is absolutely essential for good memory skills, to be able to make good visual markers and memory palaces that will stick and that can be adapted to any and all situations, rather than things just having to be so defined and limited.
Yeah, and I can't remember where the study was, but there was a study at one point in which the experimenter would show a small child how something worked and then give it to them, versus not showing them how it worked. And the children who were shown how the thing worked were much less interested in it. Essentially because the experimenter was constraining, here's what this is supposed to do. And it's like, this is the function it has. This is how you access it. But when the child is just allowed to explore the object, they don't see it from that, functional fixedness. It's like, okay, well, it could be anything.
Right.
And no one has defined what it is yet for me. And so I get to go on that exploration for myself, and they'll end up, spending a lot more time messing around with it and seeing, not just what the experimenter would have shown them, but they'll mess with it in lots of ways that, a normal person who knows what it does wouldn't do, as
Right.
part of that exploration.
A normal adult, I should say, because
Yeah.
it's the adults that have had that creativity squashed.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that was mentioned in the Punished by Rewards book.
Oh, yeah,
I read it, your
probably
recommendation.
was.
It
Yeah, I recommended that to you a while ago. That's an interesting book.
was excellent. But
Do we have 15 minutes? Is that it?
yeah, looks like it.
Wow, it flies so quick. All right, so I do want to get back to the idea of addiction. You mentioned maybe screen sharing something. Did you have like an idea of something that you wanted to share?
Oh
Or
no, that was just,
okay, just the
if it
potential.
came up,
Okay.
it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I would like.
I did have a thought though.
Yeah,
I
go
don't know if
ahead.
this is where you're going. But in terms of like what you let your kids be exposed to and interact with on a regular basis, something that I find interesting and disturbing is that our brains have not finished developing until 25 or 26.
So I've heard
And
people say that a lot, and I've never fully understood what they mean by that. Can you explain what you mean by that?
so it mostly means have the processes of both neurogenesis been completed and synaptic pruning. And these are processes that help us to kind of change the structure and what is connected to what. Because once you're past that point, you can of course still learn and change tons of things. Your brain is incredibly plastic and adaptable.
Right.
But it doesn't really happen by creating new neurons, and it doesn't even really happen so much by making new connections with other neurons. It's more just strengthening or weakening the existing connections and the existing circuits, and make kind of strengthening and weakening those connections. So when we say make new connections, it's kind of a misnomer usually.
Okay.
Usually
Good
you're
to know.
not so much making a new connection as you are strengthening an existing weak connection or something like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
But anyway, so yeah, your brain is kind of fully developed by that age. And that also means that before that age, you're a lot more susceptible to any addictions, and kind of anything that you do can get really set in a rut, because it will be built into your development, built into your growth. Kind of like how I think there's an analogy where if you put an object in a tree when it's young and then let it grow, it'll literally grow around that and incorporate that object into its structure, and it'll interfere with its branching. It can actually mess the tree up a lot,
Right.
because it's still in that growing phase. And so I just find it very kind of interesting and disturbing that our brains aren't really developed until 25 or 26, but yet a lot of the things we say adults can do, we say it's okay at 21, it's okay at 18. And even more disturbing is all the things that we let kids do, little kids.
Yeah.
Where, you know, even such things as just social media.
Right.
Like it's not a hard drug or anything, but if kids are consistently using social media for a long time when they're so young, that can set up patterns of distraction, also patterns of, I guess, what would I call that? You know how social media, everyone tries to portray their best selves, and
Yeah.
it's an easy way to feel really bad about yourself, and so that kind of self-negativity, self-criticism can become an ingrained pathway for kids.
Yeah. So that's a really good something I want to talk about. I know we're running out of time, so I want to hit this is this idea of adapting to your environment. And I always tell people you adapt to your perceived environment. And that's essentially what learning is to some extent. You're adapting to your perceived environment, which is a lot more than just like the walls around you or anything like that. It's perceptions are way more complicated than that. But I like that angle of here's what learning is and here's what it means to grow as a person. It's kind of, you can think of it as adaptation. And if that's the case, then your perceived environment's really important, and like paying attention to what is my perceived environment right now? What is it that I'm adapting to? And so you just talked about how, you know, a lot of kids growing up at this point, their environment is pretty bizarre. Like, their cyber life might be far more real and salient to them than their physical world. And you might say that's a good thing because, well, that's just kind of how our world is trending. And so maybe it's better that they, you know, be adapted to that. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's definitely a valid concern. It kind of reminds me of the Ready Player One.
Yeah, exactly.
Series, right. Yeah, I mean, there's a very valid point that, you know, kids need to learn the skills of the virtual world these days. Like, if you're going to survive and succeed, you probably need to learn how to succeed with a computer and how to succeed with the internet and everything. But there's a huge difference between the skills and then versus that becoming your life, your perceived environment, like you said. Because going back to our earlier topic, there's so many things that are just either straight up false online, like how people present themselves, or fake news and all those kind of things. It's so much, you know, false information and propaganda. But then there's also things that are legitimate, but just kind of not, they don't really jive with how our brain functions. And like I said, a lot of that can just be the kind of the overwhelm that our brains aren't really handled or built to handle so much of these stimuli. And that's why the addictions can happen.
So, but I guess to play devil's advocate, and I'm not expressing this as necessarily my viewpoint, but I'm trying to think through it myself. It's like, well, if that really is, you know, you talk about people on social media presenting a false, like it's a facade, it's not a real version of themselves. But at the same time, if that's the only version of that person that you ever interact with, like maybe you never even meet a lot of the people in the real world, can you really say that it's fake? You know, if that's the only, you know, if you only ever interact with the avatar, then it seems like it is much more relevant to you than the person if you'd meet them, in a coffee shop or something. So one of the things
Like
I've
it would
been,
become real to you essentially.
yeah, and for all practical purposes, it would be. And so one thing I've been struggling with is, like, to some extent, I'm really concerned about raising my child in the very digital world we live in, because I've just seen how miserable people can be when their primary world is the virtual world. But then at the same time, it's like, if that is the world of the future, would I be doing my child a disservice to not let them adapt to it as much as possible? And because there's always part of me that's like, well, of course, like, this is the real world out here,
Right.
not in the computer, and so they should be adapted to that. But then it's like, well, maybe that's mostly been my world, and that's been people's worlds throughout human history. But is that really the world that my child is going to live in?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, our reality is really just what our brain tells us. And so, there there is some, there are some theories of, like, we could be living in a virtual reality already. We could all be in a
Sure.
simulation and we wouldn't know the difference because it's just what our brain tells us. And so obviously I don't think you're talking that extreme of a
No,
situation, but the
not yet.
principle is the same, that kind of, if that becomes the reality, then is there, I don't know, are there ways that we can help them to succeed in that reality instead of just out of that reality?
Yeah, and I guess the question is, like, is there a should there? Can you say that since humans throughout human history have not been in a virtual reality, like, even if you adapt to it as well as you can, like, just genetically, you're not you don't exist to adapt. You're not supposed to be in that world all the time.
Right, that's not how your brain is
It's not
evolved.
how your brain's wired. Like, it can only adapt to it to a certain extent, but it's mostly not. And so
Right.
I guess you could make that argument if you're trying to say, well, I want my child to be as healthy and autonomous as possible. Well, I should help them to adapt to the world that they're actually, you know, originally hardwired to adapt to, and then, give them tools to mitigate the damage of the other stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't know. I'm still wrestling with all of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like there are definitely, like, skills you can teach your kids of how to succeed in the virtual world. But at the end of the day, they're wired to live not in a virtual world. And I don't think we can ever get away from that. I mean, maybe in a few millennia from now,
Or if
after,
we start to actually, like, learn how to engineer our brains ourselves and kind of hijack the evolutionary process or something. Yeah.
exactly. But in the meantime, we've had, like, millions of years trying to evolve and adapt to the natural physical world. And
Yeah.
so, like it or not, that's what our brains are best at. And so I feel like there will always, as far as we're concerned, always be this grounded in reality that we need of real interactions with people, including touch if possible, but
Right.
at least face-to-face interaction like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And nature and physical activity and all these things that have been just shown over and over to be good for the brain and good for mental health and good for longevity and everything.
Yeah. That's certainly my perspective so far, is that it's like, even if that is the world of the future, it's not the world that you're, biologically and meant to thrive in. And
Right.
so while you might be able to adapt to the degree that you'll be more adapted to it than anybody else in the world, it's still much, like, you're far less likely to feel fulfilled, healthy, happy, whatever, if you exist almost entirely in that world than if you don't.
Exactly, because success and happiness are not the same thing. And you might have the ultimate success online, but that doesn't mean that you feel happy.
Yeah, you might be the number one World of Warcraft player in the world,
Right.
but I'd like to meet that person. I'm kind of curious who it is. I don't know anything about World of Warcraft. But yeah, who are the people that live at the top of the virtual universe, and how are they doing? Kind of curious.
Right.
Well, we've only got 4 minutes, so I don't know how much more ground we can cover. But I mean, do you have any kind of closing thoughts? I'd love to, jump back into this conversation at some point, but
Yeah, especially by the way, your kind of thoughts or questions on like trauma.
Hmm.
We don't have time now, but I have a lot of experience with that with my wife and her family. There's a lot of messy things there, but the advantage is that I have learned a ton about how to kind of recognize, mitigate the effects of trauma. And like I said, it's really important to differentiate that from challenges, which are positive.
Right. Yeah.
But
So you'd say that differentiation is good. That's the right
yeah,
way to understand it.
right. And just as an aside, I guess, because it does relate to what we already talked about, a lot of people kind of want their children to grow up as fast as possible, right? Because
Mhm.
you can grow up faster, that means your brain is developing faster and you're kind of getting ahead in the world. And that's the idea. The interesting thing is that it's true in the sense that if you have like a traumatic childhood or you're a very like high expectations, low play, low creativity, highly academic childhood,
Mhm.
that does push your brain to develop faster, which, okay, that's good, right?
I think
Well,
I
not
see where this is
necessarily.
going. Yeah.
The problem is trauma also makes your brain develop faster. so so you can have terrible things happen to you, and when they say someone seems so grown up because they had such a rough childhood, that's actually true. Their brain is more developed, but not in good ways. It's basically
It's more
it's kind
rigid,
of
essentially. It's like it's frozen a lot
exactly
faster. Yeah.
right. It kind of cut short that critical period where they could learn and grow
Yeah.
and develop and be creative. It cuts that short, so that now they're just kind of back to being like, they have become more like one of those toys that we talked about. It's just press a
Mhm.
button and you know what it will do.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And we
That's
don't want our kids to become like that, right?
yeah. Because I mean, when people talk about, well, your brain is fully developed at 25, 26, typically I think there's some positive and some negative connotations when people talk about that. They're like, well, it's kind of like, because I hear people saying, well, I'm 50 or something. So I'm kind of like, this is who I am. I'm stuck.
Mm,
And so when they talk about it like that, they talk about it like a negative thing. And I think a lot of people do see it that way. It's like, well, I wish my brain was still as vibrant and plastic as it used to be. And
right.
so why would we push our children to grow up faster
Mhm, mhm.
when we wish that we still had
Right.
a lot of that childhood flexibility. um,
Right.
yeah.
And I hear this question a lot with like language learning,
Mhm.
because everyone knows, oh, it's so much easier for a 2-year-old to learn a new language, a second language, than it is for a 20-year-old, or especially a 40-year-old. And the fact is that's true because their brains are so undeveloped and so unset. And that's why it is so important that we make sure our kids have the optimal environment and optimal challenges,
Yeah.
trauma-free challenges, because that's all true. But the other thing that's true is that you can actually still learn a ton and change a ton no matter how old you are. I mean, think
Yeah.
how long
Right.
it takes for a kid to actually learn their first language. It takes them, what, 10 years before they can write semi-proficiently in it?
Right. Yeah.
Well, as adults, we can learn to do that in a second language in a couple of years.
Yeah, it's just trade-offs.
Right.
Well, I think this is a great place to stop and also a great like cliffhanger to jump back in the conversation. Maybe we should focus more on trauma next time. I think that'd be a great conversation to have.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to pick apart there, and it's for how much attention it deserves, it doesn't get enough attention.
Yeah. Well, thanks for chatting. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope anyone who
Me
listens
too.
to it does as well. And I will chat with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I love your thoughts and questions. You help me to learn, and also, so you help me to get curious too. I'm like, oh, I don't totally know about this thing. Let's learn more about it. So thank you.
Yeah, it goes both ways. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, take care, my friend.
Yeah. Bye.